Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway, which I hope will behave a little bit. It's a holiday here, and if I say that a lot, it's because Colombia has many holidays, and I do try to use them to my advantage for audiovisual purposes, but we shall see. Today we are going to be doing a magazine review. We're going back to Asimov's. And I think I've talked a little bit about why it's nice to have something from the digital realm, Clark's World, as well as something that's been around obviously for quite some time. Asimov's is an institution in its own right. And I think this issue is going to be a really good example of what that means to be an institution. This is something I think we are thinking about right now as a genre because we have, as always, upsets, rumors, issues, and I've been discussing this with other folks. There is this very dangerous anthropomorphization of an entity that happens a lot in modern society. Maybe it's happened in periods before as well. But in our society, I specifically talk about in relation to corporations, to formal institutions like a publication or any kind of advocacy group. And it's dangerous sometimes to anthropomorphize because the entity that we're talking about doesn't exist really above and beyond the individuals who make up not only its present but its past and the intimations of a future community that will be joining it as well. The best, the most resilient institutions are those that are fully aware of the fact that they are in fact made up of a community of voices. And they have a sense of history, they have a sense of the present, and they have a sense of thinking about the future. And I think we move best through them when that's how we approach them too. So Asimov's is a name, it's an institution, but why it's an institution is something to reflect upon when we go through the stories this time, and we think about the work that goes into making anything in our genre or other industries as well, but we're focusing on science fiction and fantasy, survive, have longevity, and be able to rise to meet any new challenges. So I've been speaking in the abstract. I'll hop into some of the concretes that have made this such a lovely issue to reflect upon this. Sheila Williams, that's the editor of Asimov's, in the July-August 2024 edition, which is the one we're going to be looking at today, has this lovely editorial in which she talks about the Dell Magazine's Award for Undergraduate Excellence in Science Fiction and Fantasy, something that was formed in 1993 in association with the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts. What a name. And it's this lovely opportunity to really cultivate, celebrate, and encourage people to pursue this passion at a young age and to see themselves as part of a community, even at a young age or when they're taking their first steps in genre. So this takes place in Orlando, Florida. It was supported by Colorado University's Creative Writing Program, and the winner this year was this lovely piece by Emma Kirkman, Lolo's Last Run, a story about, quote, dog sledding, search and recovery, and ghosts. So we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of Asimov's in terms of its tone as we go through these stories. But this is something that I love to see in general, the idea of celebrating not just people who are famous in the field, but also the work that goes into creating a space for people to rise up. It's one of the reasons that I thoroughly enjoy Clark's World, because it focuses so much on bringing people up through slush, and there isn't so much of a focus on the prestige name to try to sell a volume. And this work here too of really celebrating young people and young voices that are coming into the genre is fantastic. It's part of what creates a kind of continuity, because Asimov's has been around for an exceptionally long time. It's gone through many phases, and it will go through many phases more. But what becomes a binding thread in a publication like this is its interest in that whole timeline, which really comes through. So let's pair this again. We go into Robert Silverberg has a column, as ever, in Asimov's, and this one is on a bit of history. So we get this lovely balance between the two. The column is on C.M. Kornbluth, and the name of the column is The Vampires of Poland, so it gives you a sense of what you're in for. It uses Kornbluth stories as a kind of gateway to talking about broader cultural traditions, which is fantastic. That's a way to move past the what's already often striking on the page, to think about the context in which it was written and how it's carrying forward old concepts in our culture. Because science fiction, like all speculative fiction, is just part of the human experience, and the idea of really creating hard divisions between genre and non-genre does a disservice to the fact that humans have always had this wondering mode. So here we're looking at The Mondworm from December 1950, published in Worlds Beyond, and it's been reprinted many times since. It involves a, quote, young mutant who was born with a deadly telepathic gift after his parents, young Navy personnel, were exposed to radiation from one of our early A-bomb tests in the South Pacific. So this story has a sense of haunting because it cannot help but be of a moment. It is responding to a very serious set of real-world concerns, as the best science fiction does. So we've also got, but the wonderful element in this story is it's not just one thing. So we do have this young mutant. They've become a psychic vampire for reasons that reflect on a bigger cultural transgression. And on top of that, the story takes place in an Appalachian mining town. And there's this lovely tension of, is it possible that a vampire can meet their match in a gritty, hard-bitten community that has already seen plenty of monstrosity of its own? Maybe. Because in this town, we are also pulling on a European immigrant culture. So people who've moved to the New World carrying with them understanding of the dangers of the old. So even if there have been modern evils, and I use that word loosely, I'm very cautious about that word, but the idea that there are transgressions in our culture that are much more recent, they echo through history too. They rhyme with other incidents in the past that have been used to form some of our biggest archetypes, like the vampire, which is also very much a commentary on a problem in society. It's a class commentary. So here we also again just get such rich little details. Silverberg uses this story as a way to reflect on those histories of the immigrant cultures as well, and the ways that we know that the cultures carried. Wow, I got some very excited people on the highway today. Those cultures carry some of their traditions in tangible forms, one being the tradition in the Polish Jewish community of documented cases of padlocking graves, and that has to do with a ritual related to vampire prevention techniques. So this is this lovely, beautiful blending of science fictional past and historical past. It's going to resonate through the work in the issue itself, and there's a comfort and confidence in a publication like Asimov's. It can do that work. It's very comfortable with being a distinctly American publication, first and foremost. That means it doesn't have a problem with its context. It will very comfortably blend all kinds of science fictional scenarios with some very distinct U.S. contexts. And also, it has no problems with blending science fiction and history on the regular, because there is really only a fine, arbitrary line being drawn in the sand. So we'll get into more of that in a second. I want to finish a couple more of the points that touch on community and really how important it is to think about this breadth of work and the long-standing broader traditions in which science fiction today emerges. So James Patrick Kelly's On the Net is another commentary. It touches on the work of Sarah Pinsker, and it does this, though, in light of a bigger conversation. It's a wealth of commentary here that's inspired by the adage, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. This sense of tension, is it possible to be ekphrastic in a positive and constructive way? And of course the answer is yes. The ekphrastic mode of writing or creating anything in response to other art is something that exists throughout human creativity, and this is just a lovely reflection on the way that it manifests in some work that's extremely popular right now in science fiction. So again, that comfort, when we talk about institutionality, how we build a sense of stability, it's with demonstrating that ease in terms of moving between past and present and quote-unquote genre forms and the rest of literary tradition. Okay, two other notes before we get into the main stories. Peter Heck, my goodness, okay. It might be a busier morning than I was expecting today on the highway, but we'll see. Peter Heck on books cover so many books. How the heck, Peter Heck? Like, how are you reading all of these per each issue? I mean, I'm in the middle right now of doing a massive review of the Ursula K. Le Guin shortlist for Strange Horizons, and that, of course, is a joy, and I'm quite pleased by it, but I'm also always just so impressed by other reviewers who are able to provide such thoughtful commentary, careful commentary, thinking about the context of each book. And heck, in his on books, it's not just that he's giving a summary of each piece that he talks about, he's highlighting as well the context, the second in a series, first piece from this particular person, and there's a generosity that comes with that. He's giving a clear sense of what the book is so you can decide if it is something for you or not. But there is also an attentiveness to the writers. So just an extremely generous reviewer who covers a lot. So I'm just going to read the titles. We've got Moniquill Blackgooses To Shape a Dragon's Breath, Thomas Lee's Perilous Times, Susan diRende's Knife Witch, David R. Slayton's Dark Moon, Shallow Sea, Robert Jackson Bennett's The Tainted Cup, Gregory Frost's Rhymer, Charles Stross's Season of Skulls, Karen Lord's The Blue Beautiful World, Joe Pitkin's Exit Black, Terry Miles' The Quiet Room, Emily Skrutskie's The Salvation Gambit, and Pim Wangtechawat's The Moon Represents My Heart. Is that enough? Most of these are fantasy, which is also lovely. This issue doesn't have much in the way of fantasy, but the review list will cover a range. This one just happens to lean more fantastical with strong historical components. And there are a few sci-fi pieces as well, but that just seems to be the minority in this one. I am going to say, though, that reading through this list, I think I only recognize 2 names from other sites, which is this beautiful reminder. Social media is not the world, and there is such a wealth of wonderful work that is being produced, and we right now are living in a moment where we do not have the promotional capacities necessary to fully appreciate the wealth of work out there. And it's obviously a little bit disappointing. It often means that our genre is reduced to whatever ends up on a list, which usually ends up being shaped by which community, which niche clique is popular in any year. I personally don't necessarily think that those works always represent the best of the fiction in any given year, but they represent a slice. And the problem is right now we have many slices. We have many different corners of science fiction and fantasy, and we have not figured out a way to really unify. Maybe we don't want to suggest that everything needs to become uniform, but we're living in a very scattered mode right now, and so a lot of things are happening in different corners that I don't think everyone is aware of. So I don't know entirely what to be done about that. It just happens to be what we're moving through. As long as everyone is finding their audience, that's good, that's wonderful, and hopefully these works certainly will. One last note before we pop into the stories. The other really important part in terms of building community is recognizing the end game of community, which involves the fact that eventually authors that we love and who have been part of our world and our community are going to die. And so we have death notices spread out throughout this issue. We have death notices for John Alfred Taylor, Terry Bisson, Howard Waldrop, Tom Purdom, Christopher Priest, and Brian Stableford. And each of them is lovingly done. It is done with care and celebration for these writers who happen to be a part of Asimov's history. And they give you a sense of the different eras, the different movements, and the different phases of community that existed throughout time. So all of this creates what, in my mind, what we mean when we talk about an institution. Asimov is an institution. And there are others that are struggling right now with their sense of what comes next. In the magazine realm, in the advocacy realm, very normal. I would love to see this model used as an example. Not saying everyone needs to do exactly what Asimov does. That would be boring. Asimov already does it. But the idea of thinking about continuity, past, present, future, thinking about comfort, feeling established, feeling like one doesn't need to defend what one does because science fiction and fantasy is part of a huge tapestry, not just of other literature, but history and art in general. And if we can do that in other spheres, I think we will build the resilience that we need. So I'm going to keep that in mind as we go forward into some of the pieces. Again, I'm not going to be covering the poetry in this issue. We're just going to be focusing on the stories, of which there are many, and I have a few comments broadly, I think, that will stem and emerge from them. But let's go through them one at a time. And so I'm going in reading order, not in the order table of contents. Table of contents will always break it down by novellas, novelettes, and short stories, but I just wanted to share the reading experience. First, we have Stephen Case's Sisters of the Flare. Now, this involves a kind of massive world-ship of a kind. I'm going to use the word world-ship because I don't want to spoil intimations that come near the end about what is the shape and what is the actual nature of this construct on which people live. You know that it's something a little bit atypical in terms of the setting. Because it has Sisters of the Decalogue, it has this sort of religious feel to it that creates a different kind of affect. It creates a sense of maybe an abbey or an isolated space where everyone is performing their duty, and that is indeed what has happened here. You have the ritualization of life in this space, definitely creating these more sacred, elevated dimensions. The main story involves somebody showing up and another sister negotiating how to deal with this person who has arrived in their sector, their area of the space. We learn through the interactions between the two more about what it means to be a sister of the Decalogue, a vague sense of the mission, and with it a sense that something about the mission has maybe gone wrong. There is something that's not quite working the way it's supposed to. But these are classic stories. They go right back to the earliest generation ship stories. Heinlein, I think, had one of the classic quintessential templates for the genre, in which if the mission has gone on so long, it is quite possible that the people who are now aboard the space or living in this zone might have forgotten the fact that they are moving in a direction with a concrete, tangible outcome, and they might not necessarily have the vocabulary to address what's gone wrong. So it's lovely to move through this world just on its surface without trying to figure out exactly what's going on, what exactly has gone wrong, how this individual is thinking about fixing the problem, just to really immerse oneself in the uncanny similarity between a lot of the isolated spaces in which people have served a very purpose-driven life in our world and the way that that can be manifested in long-term transit through space as well. So we have Sister Tar, and she finds somebody wandering in the corridors of her sector of this maze of a lost home, but there is a beautiful affirmation for everyone. There's no sense of, everything you've done has been a lie. There's no destruction of the kind of ritualistic life in which they live. It's just a different way of coming home is found between the two of them, navigating different bodies of knowledge, coming up with a solution to the problem that is keeping this ship from being able to pursue its end. This is a story to just allow to roll over you. The ending, it's one of those stories too that's very patient in that it waits until near the end to give you some more concrete details about space. That's a choice. And when that choice is made by authors, it's very much, they just want you to be immersed in the world, enjoy the journey. This is one in which you can. Leah Cypress Flipped is the next story, and this one gave me such a chuckle for a reason I'll explain after. It's a high school alt-universe story, and it really immerses itself in the idea of, well, everything that's so important in high school. We've got everyone just absolutely loves Jake, and everybody imagines being with Jake, but one character can't possibly imagine it. Becca knows, Jake would never go for me. We were friends when we were small, but then everything changed. Until one day, Jake sort of slides into class and kisses her and then realizes, oh wait, you're not my Becca. And he realizes that he has slipped into an alt universe. And he's shocked to realize, what? We're not dating in this one, but we're always dating. And so this Becca, who's a different form of the Becca that he knows, is so excited. Oh my gosh, now I get to date Jake. And I think you can get a sense of where this might go. There's a reason they are called alt universes. Every little choice we make in life shapes us in different ways. We have different preferences, we have different outcomes. And so the differences between the two of them in terms of Jake's expectations of the Becca that he missed and Becca's expectations of herself, as well as the Jake in her world, they clash in some interesting ways. And the story has layers. There's some twists and turns in terms of what's actually happened with Jake in his original realm. But that's the kind of high school drama that is worth reading about instead of just having somebody talk about. I will say that this one made me chuckle because I just finished writing a story about alt universes in high school. And so when I thought about this, and first I thought to myself, okay, so I'm not submitting it to Asimov's because many people don't realize there's a wealth of reasons that your work can be rejected. And if a magazine has just recently published a piece that has similar resonance points, it might not be interested in another. Maybe, maybe not. My story has a different tone entirely. It's geared toward a different publication first. But I was struck by the fact that, yeah, it makes sense for alt universes and high school to be a perfect match, because high school is such a time of self-discovery and trying to figure out which path one wants to go on, and also feeling like every choice you make is going to set you down a timeline and that it can never be reversed. You're just locked in. So I think we talked about this with one of the stories in Clark's World last time, the one that dealt with the idea of a superstar, sort of a pop sensation, also being aligned very easily with the idea of being flung to the remote moons of our solar system. There are resonance points, there are certain settings and themes that just work beautifully together. And so high schools and alt universes might be one, and for that reason I am not sending my story to Asimov's and hoping that it'll find a home somewhere else, at least for a little while. Sometimes you wait to see what happens. The next one, Robert Morrill Jr.'s A Family Matter, is such a perfect example of what I was talking about the comfort that Asimov's has with being an American science fiction and fantasy magazine, mostly science fiction. It has, as many of the stories do in this issue, one tiny science fictional element, or maybe one or two little ones. But what makes the story work so well is its comfort with the everyday world into which it is integrating that one science fictional element. So, what is a major sort of future shock issue that we have today? It is the fact that we can open untold worlds about ourselves through genetic testing. It's very dangerous. I haven't done it myself. My sister did it for herself, so pretty much the same. And that means that I have an adjacent look at my own ancestry through that. But my family also has a lot of physical records, and so it's a part of North American culture being very interested in where we come from, and also sometimes in other parts of the world as well. But the problem is that genetic testing can often reveal unfortunate, horrible stories, sometimes in your family, mysterious connections, terrible transgressions. It's often a little bit dangerous to ask the question. Here, though, that whole concept, that whole stressor, has been addressed with that one added science fiction element, and it's a deft touch. When we discover that there's about 30% unknown DNA in the protagonist of this story, you can get a sense of where it's going. But the story is so deftly woven around the family's own anxieties already about being associated with the wrong part of the United States, with anxieties related to the war and what's happened to elder members in another era, that we slowly build toward the main issue. And even when the main reveal happens, it's done offhand. And that allows it to really hold its weight, because if there was too much attention paid to it, it would start to feel silly. The strength of the story is that it's so rooted in a mother's anxiety about the child, now an adult, not passing on their bloodline, not giving grandkids. It's anxiety about race. It's anxiety about regionalism in the United States. And there's this one added element from the mysterious bloodline that also gets our character caught up in an extremist fundy cult, has the government interested. You have a sneaking suspicion what the science fiction element is going to be. But it's done so comfortably, and that's what makes it such an impressive story. It's these premises within science fiction, many of our tropes, they're going to be played out over and over again. Thousands of stories are going to be written about them. But what is going to make certain versions of the story stand out is the way that they are distinguished through character, place, setting, and that's something that Robert Murrell Jr. has done very well. The next piece, Kenneth Schneier's Tamatsa's Future and Mine, is a story that starts with babysitting, innocuous enough, and reading stories. And the reading of stories is going to be important as a kind of doubling layer. We're slowly going to learn through the story about the person who is babysitting Tamatsa. Lemulu is not an everyday worker, even though it seems like, just a person who has community, babysits a friend's kid, works as a software engineer, has a pretty quotidian life, but not really. Lemulu is also a spy for the rebellion, and she has insinuated herself in a position with the security ministry as a software engineer to bring down the state. So again, the story is able to have a big dramatic premise, in part because it balances it so well with the quotidian. And yet through the quotidian, through the stories that Lemulu is telling to Tamatsa when reading to her at night, we also get a sense of full circle, because the stories are dramatic as well. The stories have tragic heroines. The stories have all kinds of assassins and spies and murderers. So Tamatsa is experiencing the world as it is in an extraordinary way in the middle of her everyday. And Lemulu, reading to Tamatsa, is reflecting on her big mission and the consequences of the big mission in terms of what she's going to have to sacrifice, the way that life doesn't always look or read exactly like in the stories. I'm also going to note there's something really interesting about the story. I was thinking about a lot of people wonder about how gender works in stories, and I do like to highlight the fact that gender is situational. And so there are things about the story that immediately coded Lemulu as a feminine character, even though there's no actual naming of gender because it's a first-person story. It doesn't necessarily come up explicitly, and yet it does, sort of. It comes up through the fact that this is a person who babysits. This is a person who shops online for shoes. This is a person who bakes brownies. There are female assassins, soldiers, and spies in the stories that are read to little Tamatsa. And there's a friend trying to set our protagonist up with men before gently considering maybe a woman. And it was just a really interesting rundown of the way that when we're trying to actually depict characters from any gender context, it is through their interactions, their roles, their expectations, even though this is also a software engineer as well, a very cold-blooded spy in the end, working for something much bigger than this initial moment. There are lots of little ways throughout that femininity, at least, is coded in the text. For writers, I really look through your stories and think about how you are presenting gender. How does gender emerge in your stories? Because it's not as if every story is introduced, this is X, she is woman, or this is Y, he is man. You do things with who do the characters get to talk to, who's comfortable around the characters. Would Lemulu be allowed to babysit Tamatsa if Lemulu was a male, for instance, in this story? Just think about how you do that. If you're ever worried about how you represent gender, and again, I have writers who ask me these questions and have concerns about their prose, and this is an excellent example of how it's blended in terms of how a certain kind of femininity, a certain kind of gendered character is just coded through action. And just think about how does that show up in your own text? How do you code for gender in your work? So thank you, Schneyer, for a lesson. I mean, truly, this might be a piece that I use and point to when other people ask me questions about how to write in ways that either code for or don't code for gender, to create spaces where gender is more ambiguous, which is something I prefer in my own writing, but not always, not every story, but many of my stories. Okay, that was an aside. James Van Pelt, This Good Lesson Keep. Oh my goodness. I don't want to say that I am picking favorites. It's not a competition, but I really, really enjoyed this story. This was one that I immediately recommended to some teacher friends of mine. So if you have any teacher friends in your purview, please pass it on to them. I just think it's a wonderful example of taking one science fiction element to elevate a story that otherwise is dealing very thoughtfully with the issues that we already have today. We are constantly moving through future shock. So this story adds one or two little elements to something that already happens in the world today and plays out the consequences to beautiful effect. This imagines a future present of school classrooms. The slight SF element, there are a couple of them. There's something to do with the desks, and they also have, instead of having laptops, you can just have wonderful consoles in your desks. But the key science fiction element is that one student has eye caps, a technology that allows him to truly virtual reality shift what he's seeing to be more in line with a preferred view of the world. And you might say, well, that can't be allowed in classrooms. But what happens if the program itself happens to be religiously motivated? Then there might be room for a religious exception. And then that one student is allowed to see everything through that lens, colored by that program, that virtual reality software, while everyone else is engaging in the world without that augmentation. So that's the interesting science fiction component, which is just one tiny level removed above some of the exceptions that are already built into our systems. It's not the only one, because again, a good story is never just one thing. This piece has so many tensions between different ways of seeing the world and approaching education from the student side and the teaching side. So Miss Spellmelspa is teaching Shakespeare. Her student teacher, Jed, is dazzled by the metrics of digital teaching tools and in love with rigorous department metrics. So one might think that there might be a kind of theatrical conflict between the two of them. The story is going to escalate between two different ways of thinking about education, the old way and the new way. But really, the story sits with the mess of it. The fact that there are models, pedagogical models that focus on excerpting versus pedagogical models that focus on the full work and the immersive experience. And Shakespeare is such a perfect choice for this, because as the teacher is introducing the students to the idea of interpreting work for your time and your context, the act of teaching is being interpreted for their mode and context. And that means that Jed does often present some comments that might seem abrasive, but also sometimes offers something constructive, because there are benefits to some of what Jed is doing. And obviously Millspa's approach has some benefits, but not for every student. And some students are going to not enjoy the experience as much as others, just because that is the nature of teaching and learning. And even though ICAPs definitely create a very different environment for one of the students, it's not that Andrew is so completely checked out that Andrew stops being a student and stops being somebody who wants to participate and engage and just grow as everyone else. So everyone's very human here, and the Bard is a perfect example or backdrop for that reflection on the fact that as much as things are changing, things have always been changing. Shakespeare has always been reinterpreted for the moment in which it is performed, and so must education today. Again, really enjoy that story. Okay, Susan Palwick's Yarns is the next one, and this one is, we have two teaching stories back to back, but very different teaching stories. In this one, we have an Eye of God is this monitoring device, so a little bit different than Andrew's ICAPs. It's nice to have these stories in the same issue so you can contrast some elements. It's a sort of cult, the Combine children, who have gone into the extreme depths, not just of fundamentalism on a kind of religious level, but violent clan cartel behavior, so there's a lot of killing between them. There are echoes, obviously, in this story of some anxieties that are held by people in the United States today around some of the extremist cults being built in certain pockets. This is taken to a much more cohesive extreme, where the Eye of God is a piece of tech that allows everyone to be monitored and to monitor through them the world around them, which allows these cults to just choose at any moment to do terrible damage to the world around them. And the world around them somehow is trying to go forward, and there are other things going wrong with the world. It's a world that doesn't have as many animals, it doesn't have as much stuff in general. It's harder to find many things that used to be more freely available, but most people are trying to just carry on with this extremist cult in the background. So our teacher, Irene, she helps a child, a Combine child, who has a real aptitude for school and whose father is very proud of him for having a real aptitude for school. Unfortunately, the violence hits them. Irene ends up having to run away to try to save herself. She has to try to start over, and she runs into another essentially child, a teenager who's been sent to kill her. But there too, it's just a person, and a lot of people, even in these extremist cults, kind of would love to have alternatives, would love to be able to lean into the gentleness of life, would like to be able to lean into other things besides violence and killing. So it's another very compassionate story, and thinking that even if these extremists exist in our society, it's not a uniform condition, and through children there might be different approaches to moving forward, even if it's only on an individual level. So some very compassionate stories there. Genevieve Valentine's Future Perfect is the next piece. And this one it's a grimmer, it's definitely grittier than the others, despite the fact that it is about art installations. In some ways, the story is a collection of listings of different art installations. And it imagines the art installations properly reflecting the violence and the hardship of the world ahead. So some of them are going to have a sort of faux nostalgia. Other ones are going to be quite shocking on purpose to try to call attention to violence in the world around them. And yet, in the middle of that, we have one art exhibit, which is a staging of a 1950s kitchen and its meals. It's performance art like most of the others. And yet, there's a reason that the show exists, and the hype, the mystery about why this show exists, what is it doing, what is the function of this 1950s kitchen and its meals, only comes to light during the last performance with the right guest, when the right guest arises. The whole piece has an otherworldly feel, and yet the concept at its heart, the idea that art can reach people in power and maybe provide more than that motorcycle in the background might. There we go. That art might find a way to respond to the world that we have effectively and give us some sense of a better world going forward is explored here. There is, however, I think, there's a cynicism to the ending, despite the fact that Cora's piece does seem to have achieved its end. There is this really uneasy question about whether it's really made a difference. That's one for you to sit with as a reader. We have all these sordid exhibits described. We have the purpose of the main exhibit come to light by the end. Does it really make a difference? Does art actually move and change the world? That is a question left maybe for you when you're reading it. The next piece seems to be I'm not actually sure, it's R. Garcia E. Robertson. Untouchable is the name of the piece. This is a story that takes place across colonies in our solar system, from Mars, Venus, Europa, and yet it's pegged very strongly to histories of the 20th century. It has reference points from a range of literature and political theory, as if the characters had gone to school pretty much in our time or a little bit earlier, so that they could be absorbed in the literature that was important to us and the history that was important to us, and now they are playing it out, replicating all of that history and all of those literary touchstones in another context entirely. The core story involves a series of missing teen girls, a spy who flits between colonies on big missions or maybe just to gamble, and a lot of talk about mid-century Europe. The story didn't quite work for me. It might for you. I am very particular about my uses of history in fiction, and there's this lovely essay by Umberto Eco that I love to reference, The 10 Little Middle Ages, which talks about the very many ways in which we can use history in our writing. And so I look at a piece like this, which is slapping references from the early to mid-1900s into this context or set of contexts that should have developed their own history, their own culture instead at this point. And I think, why? What is the benefit of doing this? It was especially touchy for me when it came to, there's one important site from the history of the Holocaust that's been repurposed as a replica in space, and the story explains it's like some rich fool paid for it to be built there. But then we also have this narrative voice giving the full history of the Holocaust context for this piece. So again, these people are extremely well versed in their history. of another time while living in a completely different, far-flung context where we occupy Mars, occupy Venus, occupy Europa, and we have these intrigues that are playing out there. The reason that this kind of history is sometimes done is in part because space is being used as just a kind of loose backdrop. It's a different backdrop on which to play out or reflect on history, and that can work. There's another piece that I think works, for me at least, a little bit better for that. But the reasons that we choose to use history are important to consider when we're writing our work. It doesn't feel lived in as a world in its moment because of how caught up it is in its past. You have people you've got this effortless quoting of Gertrude Stein, for instance, within a context where it doesn't really make sense why Gertrude Stein would be as commonly known, especially to the person who makes the reference. There's nothing to really explain why the characters are still so caught up in this other moment. And yet it is very common. So common. So I want to give this little note of grace. Star Trek does this all the time. Star Trek has stories that are 200 years in the future, 300, and they're always so fascinated by, jazz stylings from the 1900s or specific locations and specific literature. It's a way of flattering the reader because these are stories that can touch on things we already know, and they make us feel good because we already know them. So it might not be the most realistic, far-flung science fiction setting, but it's doing a different kind of work. Its use of history is something that suggests that the science fiction is a little bit of a backdrop, an excuse to talk about some of those histories and to bring them to life, to allow them to play out together in a slightly different context, but still be alive in our living memory. So I understand the aim in the work. Didn't quite work for me. It might work for you. Okay. Alex Irvine's You Know Me, Al. Now this one's a cute one. Again, this is such an American publication that you would have to be really concerned if there wasn't one piece about sports somewhere in the issue. And this one is about baseball. This is a really fun subgenre of science fiction where you just use that one little concept, that one little beloved element, and you let it play out in different space contexts, not science fictionalness. It is science fictional, but you're leaning on the science of different worlds in our solar system. So we have a correspondent who is writing very colloquially to a friend, you know me, Al. So telling the story, telling what's going on as they move from the moon to Mars to Ceres to some of Jupiter's moons, Ganymede, Europa, Callisto, then off to Titan, and all commenting on how baseball is played in these different spaces. And as you get further out, you have these cute little moments that tie into thinking about the actual mechanics of playing baseball in different environments, but you also have the cultures changing. There's one point where they reach an extreme on Titan. It seems like, everyone's, Jupiter's moons, any of Jupiter's moons, is when the baseball rules start to unwind, and you've got this sense of is this even baseball anymore? Can you believe it? They let the outfielders go as far back as they want. Just the hyperbole. For folks who are following baseball, there's definitely a tie-in to the fact that right now there is a science fictional component becoming reality in baseball. There are some changes to the rules that some people are grumping about because it's yet another shift from analog toward more rigid digital forms. And that is tied into this as well. There is this commentary about almost wherever this person goes in the system, there's this fear that baseball is going to be ruined by AI. So you have the sense of it's building on a real world concern, playfully played out by thinking about how would baseball be played on these other spaces, and a really generous closer when we realize that the further out we go, sometimes we come full circle, and maybe on Triton we'll find something much closer to home than we might realize. So as the further out we go, the closer we come actually to the heart of the game. It's a nice, generous piece. Mark D. Jacobson's The Weight of Oceans. Again, this is one that plays on an aesthetic that is very common to a lot of Americana. You've got the idea of two teenagers tearing out into the night together, one last ride, one last night of adventure. But in this case it is actually because their town is going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed for a reason that becomes clear in the course of this piece. There is corruption. A corporation just doesn't want to be bothered to keep holding back the weight of the ocean that has been protecting it from so long. It's this little tiny bubble paradise world. It has a very, I don't know, maybe 60s, 70s feel in terms of, they go off on mopeds, they have, they're teenagers, but they have bar encounters, and there's just this little teenage adolescent thrill to a lot of what they do, sex on the beach and exciting events of a certain era, at least, in Americana. And here, the tension is that all of those things are true for a variety of literature. In science fiction, the added component of this city should maybe have never existed in the first place. Who would build a place like this? In the periphery is the understanding that this echo of that kind of Americana was always constructed, it was always curated, and it was always in peril of being destroyed at any moment. In this piece, that peril is literalized. You have a very concrete enemy, you have a very concrete sense of what's causing this, and there's no real solution. The characters just have to try to figure out how they're going to survive their last night, tearing off on mopeds to just enjoy the last bit of freedom that they can. So, again, the comfort in familiar American contexts really helps with a story like this. It has one little added sci-fi element which helps to enlighten or reveal aspects of the world that we live in. And that brings us to our last piece. And this one, I mentioned that the earlier piece that uses history was not necessarily my favorite in terms of its use. This one comes closer to my preference. And it is John Richard Trtek, Trtek, so I apologize for mispronunciation if I did. The 16th Circumstance. It is a Frenchman in space. And you are definitely going to get a sense of French diplomacy, a very specific era. I think there's also, it's unavoidable. You're going to get a sense of Hercule Poirot, Belgian though he is, in this piece, because there's intrigue, there's a little sense of a mystery. It is a diplomatic story. It is closer to the mode of a lot of wonderful spy writing, but I think for average readers that they can't help it. There's going to be that association as well to the idea of this strange little figure with a French accent who happens to be moving through other worlds. And it does affect an entire mode and era of writing. The idea of moving to different lands is something that's very common in colonial literature. The idea of, or literature of empire, I should say. So whether it's British diplomacy or French diplomacy, you go to these other spaces and they have lots of fascinating locals, you learn about their traditions, and there's intrigue, and you yourself are serving certain bureaucratic overlords in this case, but there is a system that you serve even when you are in the middle of pleasantries and diplomatic negotiations, trying to smooth things over with everyone you meet. So Monsieur Picot, again, I think the words are so close that you can't help it. There's going to be an affect as well, affective relationship to some of the Poirot contexts, is an inquisitor. And we first find them on Aphelion, a remote world beyond the Panharmony. So the idea is that it's a little bit beyond the frontier. And here he's engaged in talks with some fellow arrivals, other people who have also come to this space to try to cultivate the best, the Fastines, and they have a fascinating spiritual relationship with inanimate objects. There's a sense of consumption is very important for their culture, which is great for a Frenchman. I mean, again, classic French mode of writing. Food is so important. So talking about meals in a space context, very cleverly done here, and food being extremely important to the rest of the story that unfolds. It fits so it fits well. The historical components, that sense of nostalgia, not only for a different era in stories of empire, but also a mood that is used in other literary forms even today, spy writing, thrillers that are or intrigue novels that are set in that context. This story comfortably leans on those modes, comfortably leans on that history, without necessarily thrusting things out of time and place. There's nothing anachronistic about anything that our main character says, even if it is on its surface kind of strange, a Frenchman in space. Okay, Why French? What does France look like? What does the community look like? There are questions behind the scenes. So, in this one, we have a story of intrigue that you are really encouraged to sit with and just let roll over you, because it is the nuances of diplomacy that matter most here. And even though we might think on at first blush that there is a major intrigue involving other species, it's more a matter of trying to reconcile or smooth over a problem that was caused by past actions within this whole diplomatic apparatus. And it's something that involves the system itself that Pico belongs to, as well as the context in which he's moving. So he's going to move between worlds, he's going to move between cultures, and he's going to draw upon the language, the litany, the fasting litany is the spiritual construct of one of the aliens in the story, to come to a better sense of resolution for something that is, in the end, quite germane to his own practice, his own job, his own circumstances. It's a work of diplomacy in space. Okay. Many of these pieces here you are really encouraged to sit with, both because they have a literary tone and an historical context that allows you to see them as extremely close to home. They are familiar because they are tied in very comfortably to other literature and to other historical moments and to contexts in this moment, especially in US culture, whether in a classroom or with genetic testing, that are familiar. The science fiction elements add a little bit more. They enhance the work more or less, and almost across the board, and yet they serve. You can clearly tell that the science fictional concepts themselves are not the be-all and end-all of the story. They are always coming back to the human, which is why, again, this is such a lovely issue for talking about the building of community in general, because it is so thoroughly entrenched in the human. From beginning to end, it talks about up-and-coming writers in the genre. It talks about people who have died after having contributed so generously and provided so many wonderful worlds. It talks about different people writing work that might not necessarily be promoted as widely on social media or as well known in a lot of the loudest circuits of our genre, let's put it that way. And it also comfortably encourages people to think not only about the stories, but the contexts in which they emerge. This, to my mind, is a really good template for thinking about institutionalism in terms of how do we create a structure that feels stable, that feels like it can hold the vast multitudes of our genre. A publication like this, an issue like this, offers some really good food for thought. So, apologies for the rough and tumble background today, but hopefully some of that got through, and thank you again so very much for your time with this piece and my rambles. I hope that this has you've come away maybe, if you're a writer, with some thoughts about how you're going to pursue your own practice, whether in terms of how you're writing about gender, how you're writing about history, or if you are also wrestling with the question of community, what it might mean to you to build a sense of timeline, a continuity, past, present, and future into your own work and whatever you do. So those are my closing thoughts for you. Thank you as ever. Again, liking and subscribing does do things for the algorithm behind the scenes. So if you did enjoy any of this and would be inclined to hear more of my work going forward, thank you very much for your time and your support. Have a great day.